We turn now to California, where Governor Gavin Newsom has announced his plan of dismantling the nation's largest death row, which houses more than 695 people. Newsom, who placed a moratorium on executions 3 years ago, plans to move those currently living on death row to other prisons within 2 years. California, which carried out its last execution in 2006, is one of 28 states that still maintain death rows. Here to discuss is Nina Salarno, president of Crime Victims United of California, and Reverend Brandi, deputy director of death penalty action and professor of public policy at the University of Maryland. Thank you both for joining me tonight.
Thank you
for having me.
Nina, let me start with you. You work for an organization that protects the rights of crime victims and their families, among other things, of course. So the governor's news of shutting down death row wasn't a welcomed one. Why?
It certainly was not welcome for victims, and especially those victims associated with the murderers on death row. It's justice not only delayed, it's justice denied for them by having him first put on the moratorium, which when he was running for governor of California, he was specifically asked if he would follow the law, and in particular the law of the death penalty, which he guaranteed the voters that he would. And then I was actually present at the meeting 48 hours later when he put on the moratorium. I sat there with the father of poly class, Mark class, and just watched the trauma that he had to relive. And now the dismantling, again, is just putting more salt in the wounds for those victims. It is the governor not following the law or the will of the people of the state of California. So it's twofold. For the victims, it's just devastating news. It's just more injury to them, more trauma, and mistrust of our governor and government. And on the other hand, for the people of the state of California, he's completely usurped the law and the will of the people of the state of California.
Reverend Slaughter, your organization works to end the use of the death penalty. So obviously the administration's decision to dissolve the state's death row was a step in the right direction for you and your organization. What is your take on what Nina just said and the governor's decision?
Yeah, well, let me start with the decision. I mean, just like his decision to dismantle the execution chamber, this to me is a strong symbolic gesture, recognizing that in California, you have to abolish the death penalty by a change to the Constitution. And so I would look at this move as it being courageous. And we know that in California, there's been a voluntary program for about a year, and people have been moved to general housing pretty successfully. In other states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, they already disperse people on death row to various prisons across the state and to places that have less restrictive confines. I think the issue here is the details. I think the devil is in the details. And, how will they do it? What will be the rules? How will we ensure safety of everyone in the environment? As it relates to murder victim family members, part of the reason why I am the abolitionist that I am today is hearing from folks that have lost loved ones at the hands of another and their calls for the abolition of the death penalty. One of the most compelling persons that I speak to pretty regularly is Reverend Sharon Risher. She's on our board at Death Penalty Action, and she lost her mother in the shooting at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. And it's her calls for forgiveness that are rooted in faith. And the fact that she believes that if she had to wait by the time he would be up for execution, that's a long time to wait to heal. And so, there are differing opinions from murder victim family members. And while I respect the position of the colleague here today, one of the compelling reasons why I am as strong as an abolitionist that I am today is hearing from multiple folks talk about how they would rather see money spent to support them in their trauma and give resources to murder victim family members and not keeping folks on death row.
Nina, let me just ask you just a simple question. It may not be a simple answer, but why do you support the death penalty?
Because I strongly believe in the rule of law to begin with. And in California, we did vote it in twice. And just recently, we voted to streamline the process. With that aside, the reason why is I actually opened the first Office of Victim Services for the state of California. And as that, I started the Death Penalty Project, wherein we brought in every victim associated with the murderers on death row so that their voices could be heard both at clemency and be present during the execution. My experience, although again, with my colleague here, I understand where she's coming from and her experience. My experience is markedly different. For these victims, and I worked on 5 executions where they all spoke, they all got to be a part of it. It brought to them the ultimate peace for them. As a victim of a murder victim myself, whose murderer is in California State Prison but comes up for parole under a life sentence. I've done 13 parole hearings under a life sentence. It never ends. But for the murder victims associated with those on death row, when an execution is finally brought to fruition and completed, it allows them to move forward. I walked out with a young rape victim, a surviving rape victim from a homicide where 9 women had been assaulted and killed. And what she said to me at the end of it truly is what the death penalty does for these victims. She said, "Thank you. For the first time in 15 years, I am going to sleep and not worry that he's going to come back to kill me." And to my colleague's point about the governor being courageous, actually, the governor's being arrogant. California voters twice voted in the death penalty, just recently with Prop 66, where he's cherry picking out a line about putting them into other prisons, yet he's not enforcing the entire law, which was to streamline the death penalty process in California. So he's not courageous, he's arrogant. He thinks he is above the law and the will of the people.
Well, Nina, just to push back a little bit, I mean, could you agree that laws can be wrong sometimes, that they can be unfair, they can be applied unfairly? We see laws overturned all the time. I understand you're saying that you respect the rule of law, but I mean, do you also maybe understand that death penalty rates, the margin of error can be so big that, I mean, we do a death penalty segment every week, and we have people who, through evidence, have been proven to not be the perpetrator of a crime, but have spent decades on death row and were close to being executed. So do you understand maybe why the governor, who, I'll read a quote that he said, the prospect of ending up on death row has more to do with your wealth and race than it does your guilt and innocence.
And actually, the governor's wrong because statistically, from the Bureau of Justice and the DPIC, white people on death row are twice as likely to be executed. So he's actually false in his facts. And secondly, the issue comes down to if he doesn't like the law, then run an initiative to undo the initiative that we supported. He said in the meeting with Mark Klass, it was based on his personal belief. And nobody in government should inject their personal belief over the law. That is tyrannical. That is tyrannism. That is not democracy. We ran an initiative, the people of the state of California, and all those arguments were made against it. The people still voted it in. If he felt strongly that Prop 66 needed to be turned over, he's got the wealth and the means to run an initiative himself. But he does not have the right to inject his personal philosophy above the law. And there are protections, as we know. And I have seen your show and I admire it, but there are protections. There are every avenue. That's why we have appeals processes. That's why we have DNA retesting in California. We have everything to ensure that those that are convicted and condemned are the ones that committed the crime.
Reverend, your response, please. I struggle with the data points that were raised. I understand there are 690 death sentences in California currently, and 68% of those are men of color. 66% of those are women of color. And so what we're talking about here are people that could be my son, my uncle, my brother, people. And then I know exonerees, personally. I could pick up the phone and call them, and many of them were exonerated because they were railroaded by prosecutorial misconduct or people that witnesses that lied, or all of these things that are not giving people opportunity throughout the entire process, the capital process. Further, just if you think about the fact that depending on where you live, predicates whether you can even be put forth for the death penalty. If I live in a rural county that can't afford to move a case forward, then I'm likely to not even face the death penalty. Whereas if I live in a an urban community, I could very well face it. So for me, it's I struggle because I don't know where she got the data point from, but I will say that that's not consistent with what we see across the country. The last two men that were executed in this country were both Black men, one with intellectual disability, one with mental health concerns. I mean, we're talking about cruel and unusual punishment. This system is flawed, and I don't think we can afford to get it wrong. We've gotten it wrong in this country for 186 people. And, I think to the point of me saying that the governor was courageous, I absolutely think he is courageous. And I think, being the person that has to sign off and say, I'm going to end this person's life, and I'm not 100% sure that they committed a crime, that's egregious. And that should trouble our morality.
All right, guys, I'm being told that we need to go to break. I want to go ahead and extend this conversation out just for a few more minutes, if you all can stand by. Nina Salarno, president of Crime Victims United of California and deputy director at Death Penalty Action, Reverend Brandi, stand by. More Making the Case after this.